Ted Bundy, a name that still sends shivers down people's spines. A man who proved that you really can spend as much time in the world with someone without truly knowing who they are. Ted Bundy has continued to fascinate the world even decades after his rampage ended, but we are still left asking questions. Hello and welcome to Seeking Answers, and this is the life and crimes of Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November the 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont to mother Eleanor Louise Cowell, though she always went by her middle name while her son would forever be known as Ted. The identity of his biological father has long remained a mystery. His birth certificate shows the name of Lloyd Marshall, a salesman and Air Force veteran, though this parentage has never been confirmed. His mother Louise claims that she was actually seduced by an old money war veteran named Jack Worthington. Therefore, many files actually list him as the official biological father, though again it's uncertain. For the first 3 years of Ted's life, he lived in Philadelphia with his mother's parents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. They were a religious family and knew that they would be shunned if people discovered that Louise had conceived a child outside of wedlock. Because of this, his grandparents maintained a facade that they were actually his parents and Louise was his older sister. This illusion was kept up until Ted discovered the truth in his teen years, though some speculate it was a bit later. He was shown his birth certificate by his cousin, who was extremely cruel towards him, mocking him for his illegitimate birth and heavily bullying him. Ted had a strong hatred and resentment towards his mother for never telling him the truth about his biological father, and for allowing him to find out the facts all by himself. Despite his parental issues, Ted always spoke warmly of his grandparents and seemed close with his grandfather Samuel, almost idolizing him. However, in later years, it was discovered that his grandfather was a violent bully and a bigot who discriminated against blacks, Italians, and Jews. He often showed violence towards his wife and their family dog, and would even swing the neighbors' cats around by their tails. There was even an incident where he threw Louise's younger sister Julia down a flight of stairs, simply for oversleeping. He was often seen speaking out loud to unseen presences, and would fly into violent rages whenever Ted's paternity was brought up. During her pregnancy, anytime Louise even considered having an abortion, her father would enter an angry tirade, forbidding it entirely, forcing her to keep the child. Because of this behaviour, some family members believed that it was actually Samuel himself who impregnated his own daughter Louise, though there's nothing to confirm this. By contrast, Ted's grandmother Eleanor was a timid and obedient woman, often suffering from depression. She wouldn't even leave the house towards the end of her life. But during Ted's early years, he began showing alarming behaviour. His Aunt Julia once awoke from a nap to find herself surrounded entirely by knives from the kitchen. Ted, who was only 3 years old at the time, was standing by her bed, smiling at her. In 1950, Louise changed her surname to Nelson before she and her now 4-year-old son left Philadelphia to live with some cousins in Tacoma, Washington. A year later, she met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook, and they got married later that same year before he adopted Ted as his own, now officially making him Ted Bundy. The two would conceive 4 more children together. Ted, however, always remained distant despite Johnny trying to keep him included. But Ted always had some animosity towards him as he wasn't his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money.
I grew up in a wonderful home with 2 dedicated and loving parents, one of 5 brothers and sisters. We as children were the focus of my parents' lives, where we regularly attended church, 2 Christian parents who did not drink, they did not smoke, there was no gambling, there was no physical abuse or fighting in the home.
During their time in Tacoma, the young Bundy roamed the neighborhood searching people's trash for pictures of naked women. He was an avid reader of detective magazines and crime novels, and he was addicted to true crime documentaries, but was specifically interested in the sexual violence side of things, though he also took a liking to the images of dead or maimed bodies. He drank alcohol at a young age and searched the neighborhoods for undraped windows so he could spy on women undressing. He was also allegedly caught dragging young girls into the woods to urinate on them.
You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you made or printed and video or film or
film,
photos,
magazines, what have you. Yeah.
And then there was the urge to take that little step or big step over to a physical event.
Some people would say that, well, I've seen that stuff and it doesn't do anything to me. And I can understand that. Virtually everyone can be exposed to so-called pornography, and while they're aroused to it to one degree or another, not go out and do anything wrong.
Addictions are like that. They affect some people more than they affect others.
Well,
but there is a percentage of people affected by hardcore pornography in a very violent way, and you're obviously one of them.
That was a major component, and I don't know why I was vulnerable to it.
He often chose to be alone, claiming that he didn't understand relationships or friendships. He didn't know how to develop them or what specifically made people friends. He didn't understand social interactions. Despite this, fellow classmates at Woodrow Wilson High spoke fondly of Ted, calling him well known and well liked during his time there. The only athletic activity that interested him was downhill skiing, which led to him stealing equipment and forging lift tickets. He was arrested at least twice during high school on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. However, by the time he hit the age of 18, it was erased from his record, a basic practice in the state of Washington. Ted Bundy graduated high school in 1965 before moving on to the University of Puget Sound for a year, but then transferred to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, Bundy actually started dating a girl from his class who is most commonly referred to as Stephanie Brooks, though her real name was Diane Edwards. In 1968, he dropped out of college and began working a bunch of minimum wage jobs before volunteering at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. And Ted Bundy even became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during his campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. Not long after, Diane Edwards ended her relationship with Bundy, claiming she was frustrated at his immaturity and lack of ambition in life, with seemingly no future goals or prospects. She returned to her family in California, and many point to this as one of the key elements that spurred Ted's downward spiral into madness. Bundy took the breakup pretty hard and appeared to have been completely heartbroken. He traveled to Colorado and then visited relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia before enrolling at Temple University. It was around this time Ted most likely discovered the truth about his birth, which many believe was also a contributing factor to his dwindling psyche. Once Bundy was back in Washington near the end of 1969, he met Elizabeth Klepfer, though she would later retell her story under the fake name of Elizabeth Kendall, a single mother and divorcee from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary on the university campus. She began a relationship with Ted, which ended up being a little more than she had bargained for. She described Ted as sweet, charming, and very confident. He often pampered Elizabeth and treated her like a princess. She called him a great father figure to her daughter, whose name varies between Tina or Molly, the latter being most probable. Ted seemed like the perfect man to her, and she very quickly fell in love with him. As the 1970s rolled around, Bundy seemed to know where his life was headed and returned to the University of Washington as a psychology major. He became well respected and appreciated by his professors and blossomed into a true honor student. In 1971, he took on a job at Seattle Suicide Hotline Crisis Center where he met Anne Rule, who became a close friend and later his biographer. But even Rule admitted that she saw nothing disturbing about him whatsoever. He was kind, solicitous, and empathetic. Ted graduated from the university in 1972 before joining Governor Daniel J. Evans for his re-election campaign. Due to his work there, Evans actually appointed Ted to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee, before he was hired as an assistant to the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, Ross Davis. Davis liked Bundy, describing him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. During this time, Elizabeth had actually fallen pregnant with Ted's child. However, they both agreed that now wasn't the right time for them to become parents, as their lives were far too preoccupied. Elizabeth terminated the pregnancy, and Ted was incredibly caring and sympathetic throughout the entire ordeal. Despite some mediocre test scores, in early 1973 Ted was accepted into law school at the University of Utah, which was backed up with letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and many other psychology professors. In the summer of that year, despite still being romantically involved with Elizabeth, Ted reunited with his ex-girlfriend Diane Edwards, who was impressed with his transformation, now as a serious, dedicated professional who had a future legal and political career ahead of him. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence, let alone relationship. Bundy started the Utah Law School by the end of 1973 as things with Diane began to heat up. She would fly to Seattle several times to stay with him, and they even discussed marriage. He would often introduce her to people as his fiancée. But despite this intensity, in January of 1974, Ted randomly broke off all contact with Diane completely. He ignored all of her phone calls and letters for an entire month. When she finally managed to get a hold of him, she wanted to know why he decided to end things so abruptly without explanation. Ted, in a completely calm voice, stated that he had absolutely no idea what she was talking about before hanging up the phone. She would never hear from him again. Bundy later claimed that he just wanted to prove that he could marry her if he wanted to, but Diane believed he did this as a revenge scheme for her breaking up with him so many years prior. At this point, Ted began skipping classes at law school, and by April he quit showing up altogether. It was around this time he committed what most consider the first of his heinous crimes.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. To wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment, absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
Just after midnight on January the 4th, 1974, around the same time he ended the relationship with Diane, Ted Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who was a dancer and student at the University of Utah, and bludgeoned her with a metal rod from her own bed frame while she slept. He then proceeded to sexually assault her with either that very same rod or a metal speculum, causing several internal injuries. Amazingly, Karen, who was unconscious for 10 days, did actually survive, though with permanent physical and mental disabilities due to the attack. In the early hours of February the 1st, Ted broke into the basement room of a 21-year-old University of Utah undergraduate named Lynda Ann Healy, who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He proceeded to beat her unconscious, then dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and boots before carrying her away. Lynda Ann Healy would be Bundy's first ever confirmed murder. Her remains were later found near a mountainside.
It's a very difficult thing to describe. The sensation, of reaching that point where I knew that it was like something had, say, snapped. That I knew that I couldn't control it anymore. That these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody.
On March the 12th, 19-year-old Donna Gail Manson, a student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, left her dorm to attend a jazz concert, but never showed up. Her remains were never found, despite Bundy claiming he disposed of her body at the same mountainside as Lynda Ann.
Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
On April the 17th, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt vanished on her way back to her dorm after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Her remains were discovered later again at the mountainside. 2 witnesses later came forward to claim that they saw a man with his arm in a sling asking these women for help carrying some books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Bug. On May the 6th, 22-year-old Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dorm at Oregon State University in Corvallis to have some coffee with friends but never made it there. Her remains were also later found at that same mountainside.
The brutal urge to do that kind of thing, and then what happens is once it has been more or less satisfied and recedes, you might say, or is spent, that sense, that kind of energy level recedes, and basically I became myself again.
The police were growing frustrated and extremely concerned. There was no physical evidence left behind as the bodies weren't found until months later, and the missing women had no connections. They were all young, attractive, white college females with long hair parted in the middle. That was all they had to go by. On June the 1st, 22-year-old Brenda Carol Ball vanished after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen talking to a man in the car park with brown hair and his arm in a sling. Her remains were later found at the same mountainside a year later. In the early hours of June the 11th, 18-year-old University of Washington student Georgann Hawkins vanished whilst walking down a brightly lit alleyway between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house. Ted managed to lure her to his car before using a crowbar to knock her unconscious. He then handcuffed and drove her to Issaquah, where he strangled her to death. He then spent the entire night with her body and would later visit it on 3 separate occasions. He even confessed to returning to the alleyway the next morning during the crime scene investigation, and he managed to find and remove Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes to hide the evidence, without being caught.
Each time I'd harm someone, each time I'd kill someone, there'd be an enormous amount, especially at first, enormous amount of horror, guilt, remorse afterwards. But then that impulse to do it again would come back even stronger.
Detectives and experts searched the entire alleyway on their hands and knees for any evidence, but found nothing. Bundy's attention to detail to remove absolutely every trace of him ever being there still shocks detectives to this day. Some witnesses came forward to claim that they saw a man that night in an alley behind the dorm, on crutches with his leg in a cast, struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman claimed he asked her for help carrying the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Bug. Ted was notably charming, intelligent, and good-looking, often using these traits as manipulation to gain the trust, sympathy, and interest of the young women. During this time, Ted was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and would later go into the Department of Emergency Services. This very agency actually helped in the search for the missing women. It was here he met and began to date Carole Ann Boone, again behind the back of Elizabeth Klepfer. Over the years, Elizabeth did find Ted being unfaithful with other women, but always took him back out of love and trust. Bundy manipulated her and promised to change, but continued the same pattern, often growing angry and talking to her in violent outbursts. The reports of the attack and disappearances all became public and fear began to spread, with pressure being added to the police force, but the lack of physical evidence continued to make things difficult. They also noticed that all the disappearances took place at night, near construction work within a week of midterm or final exams, and all of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans. Furthermore, the sightings of a man in a cast or sling with a brown or tan Volkswagen Bug were becoming more frequent. But this would change on July the 14th, when 2 abductions took place in broad daylight on a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington. 5 witnesses described a young, attractive man in a white tennis outfit, his left arm in a sling with a light accent, possibly Canadian or British, introducing himself as Ted and asking for their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-coloured Volkswagen Bug. 4 of them refused, but 1 agreed. However, she reached his car, saw that he had no sailboat, and quickly fled the scene to safety. He then approached 23-year-old probation caseworker Janice Ott, and she was seen leaving the beach with him. Just 4 hours after she was last seen, 19-year-old computer programming student Denise Naslund left a picnic to go to the toilet, but never returned. Bundy would later claim that Janice Ott was still alive by the time he brought Denise Naslund to her. He forced one to watch him murder the other, though this is a story that he later retracted and denied happening.
Are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
With this many witnesses, however, the police now had a detailed description of Ted and posted flyers all throughout Seattle. A University of Washington psychology professor, Anne Rule, his own girlfriend Elizabeth Klepfer, and even an employee of his all recognized him from the sketch and believed, based on the witnesses, that Ted Bundy was possibly responsible. Elizabeth had slight suspicions beforehand, but the first sketch presented she felt looked nothing like him. However, the second drew a striking resemblance, though not entirely. Their hair didn't match. She confided her concerns to a friend, but the possibility of Ted murdering these people and then using his real name just seemed silly to them. Regardless, they suggested she at least inform the police to ease her mind, especially considering the fact that Bundy had told her that he was visiting Lake Sammamish the same day of the disappearances, which she found odd as neither of them had ever been there before. However, detectives were receiving around 200 names a day. A clean-cut, handsome law student with no criminal record seemed unlikely to be guilty of these crimes, and they soon discarded him as a potential suspect.
Part of the shock and horror for my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy, and I mean I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay.
In August of 1974, Ted received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving his girlfriend Elizabeth in Seattle, Washington. They would still talk on the phone a lot, but he continued to date at least a dozen other women behind her back. Unfortunately, during his time at the university, he was saddened to realize that the other students were far more intelligent than he was, which really disheartened him as he began to struggle with the work. On September the 2nd of that same year, Ted raped and strangled an unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, and then either disposed of the remains in a nearby river or returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. It's unclear which, as her remains were never found and her identity remains a mystery. On September the 6th, 2 hunters found the skeletal remains of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund near a service road, 2 miles from where they were taken. Other body parts were discovered, which Ted would later identify as being Georgann Hawkins. It wasn't until 6 months after this, even more remains were discovered and later identified as many of the missing girls. Now the victims, who had all vanished from different locations, had somehow wound up being buried together in the same place. Suddenly, the police realized that all of these cases were most likely connected.
I can't begin to understand the pain that the parents of these children that I have, and these young women that I have harmed, feel. And I can't restore really much to them, if anything. And I won't pretend to, and I don't even expect them to forgive me, and I'm not asking for it. That kind of forgiveness is of God, and if they have it, they have it. If they don't, well, maybe they'll find it someday.
On October the 2nd, Ted attacked and murdered 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in a small suburb of Salt Lake City. He buried her remains near Capitol Reef National Park, but they were never discovered. On October the 11th, young pharmacy student Rhonda Stapley was waiting for a bus outside the University of Utah, but it was running late. Bundy slowly drove past and pulled up, offering her a lift, which she accepted. Rhonda did notice that the door to the passenger side had no handle to get out, but as a fellow student, she didn't consider this unusual. Ted seemed charming and genuine as always, introducing himself with his real name, and they bonded over both being students. However, Ted drove straight past the university campus and asked if it was okay for him to run a quick errand first. Again, not finding this strange, Rhonda agreed until he continued driving and went straight past the turn he told her he was going to take. They drove up to Big Cottonwood Canyon and he began to look for a place to park. Rhonda assumed he was just looking for somewhere to make out, so although uninterested and uncomfortable, she still didn't think that she was in any immediate danger, until the car stopped. Ted whispered, "I'm going to kill you," before he violently strangled her to unconsciousness and then raped her. Rhonda tried to fight him off, and at some point during the struggle, Bundy made the mistake of turning his back on her for just a second. Rhonda used this opportunity to make a run for it, landing in a lake which carried her away and thankfully saved her life. She then had to hike 10 miles back to safety and didn't tell anyone of this horrific ordeal for almost 40 years. Like many assault victims, Rhonda blamed herself for getting into the car of a complete stranger, and was scared that nobody would believe her or would simply judge her for her decisions. Over the years, she suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, having frequent nightmares, reliving the ordeal, and decided to finally speak out in 2011. On October the 18th, 1974, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. Her naked body was found 9 days later in a nearby mountainous area. It is believed that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days after disappearing. She was beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. On October the 31st, 17-year-old Laura Ann Aime vanished just after midnight after leaving a cafe 25 miles south of Lehi, Utah. Her body was found naked on Thanksgiving, 9 miles northeast of American Fork Canyon. Laura's face was beaten so badly that when her father was brought in to identify her body, he could only do so based on the scars on her arms from where a horse had thrown her into barbed wire when she was 11. Both Laura and Melissa were subject to bizarre post-mortem rituals which included Bundy shampooing their hair and applying makeup to their faces. On November the 8th, Ted approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carole DeRonch at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. He identified himself as Officer Roseland and claimed that someone had tried to break into Carole's car. He even provided a badge to prove that he was with the police force. Despite her car seeming fine, he insisted on her accompanying him to the police station to file a report anyway. Not long into the drive, Carole realized that they were not going in the direction of the police station and quickly brought it to Ted's attention, who immediately pulled the car over and attempted to handcuff her. However, during the hectic struggle, Bundy accidentally fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, allowing DeRonch to open the car door and flee to safety. Later that same evening, 17-year-old student Deborah Jean Kent disappeared 20 miles north of where Carole DeRonch was attacked. She left a theatre production at the Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher later claimed that a stranger had asked both her and Deborah Kent to come out to the car park to identify a vehicle. Another student claimed the same man was even pacing in the rear auditorium, and he was seen again shortly before the play ended. Her remains weren't identified for another 41 years, after some minor skeletal remains near the area were found but not sent for DNA analysis until 2015, and were finally verified to have been Deborah Jean Kent. During the search for evidence outside the auditorium, a key was discovered, and unfortunately for Ted, this key successfully unlocked the handcuffs left on the wrist of Carole DeRonch, now connecting him to both attacks. In November that year, Elizabeth Klepfer noticed that the disappearances had now followed Ted to Salt Lake City, Utah as well. She had also noticed some crutches in his apartment which many witnesses claim was used to entice the victims to go with him, convincing her further that he was involved. She decided to call the police for a second time. Elizabeth still loved and wanted to trust this man deeply, but couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible, though she hoped that she was wrong. He was now rising as the #1 suspect. However, witnesses from the Lake Sammamish disappearances, who saw this man more than anyone, failed to identify Bundy from a photo lineup. Ted had a habit of shaving his head or beard or growing them out to change his appearance to deter witness accounts. But at the request of Elizabeth, the police did add him back to the list of suspects anyway, though no evidence could link him to the crimes in Utah. She called them up 2 more times, but her concerns were dismissed. Sometimes she was told they'd be looking into him, but they never would. There was even a previous encounter where Ted attacked Elizabeth during a trip to a lake, but since she was still trying to protect the man she loved, she kept this to herself for quite some time. I was sitting on the edge of the raft, paying attention to nothing in particular, when suddenly and without warning Ted lunged at me, put his hands on my shoulders and pushed me into the river. The plunge into the icy water took my breath away. I came up sputtering and grabbed the rope on the edge of the raft, too dazed for the moment to do more than hang on. I looked up at Ted and our eyes locked. His face had gone blank, as though he was not there at all. I had a sense that he wasn't seeing me. I struggled to pull myself into the raft. He didn't move. He didn't speak. I could find no expression on his face. "Why do you have to ruin everything?" I began when I could finally talk. "That's not funny at all." He still looked at me as if I were a stranger. Then he looked away and said, "It was no big deal. Can't you take a joke?" In January of 1975, Ted Bundy returned to Seattle, Washington after his final exams and spent a week with Klepfer, having absolutely no idea that she had reported him to the police on more than one occasion, though she did plan to visit him in Salt Lake City that summer. On January the 12th, 23-year-old registered nurse Karen Eileen Campbell vanished whilst walking down a well-lit hallway between an elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her naked body was discovered a month later next to a dirt road just outside the resort. She was killed by numerous blows to the head from a blunt instrument, which left many indentations on her skull. Her body also had many deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March the 15th, 26-year-old ski instructor Julie Cunningham was walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend, 100 miles northeast of Snowmass, Utah, when Bundy approached her on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car. He then clubbed and handcuffed her before assaulting and strangling her at a different location near Rifle, 90 miles west. Weeks later, Bundy made a 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City just to visit her remains. On April the 6th, 1975, 25-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson vanished near the Utah-Colorado border whilst riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were discovered under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. Bundy claims he threw the body into the Colorado River, but it was never recovered. On May the 6th, Ted lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City, back to his hotel room, where he drowned and sexually assaulted her, before disposing of her body in a river. Police believe it to have been the Snake River, though she was never found. During May, 3 of Bundy's colleagues, including the aforementioned Carole Ann Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed in his apartment for a week, but none noticed any strange behaviour. A month later, Ted spent a week in Seattle with Elizabeth, where the two began to discuss wedding plans, hopefully for the following Christmas. Elizabeth again kept it to herself that she was talking to the police, and Bundy kept it to himself that he was involved in numerous other relationships at the same time. On June the 28th, Susan Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Her remains were never found. In August or September of 1975, it's unclear which, Ted was baptized in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, despite not being an active participant in the services, and the fact that he ignored most of the church's restrictions. Ted was raised in a religious household, but only converted later on in life for reasons known only to himself.
You have accepted the forgiveness of Jesus Christ and are a follower and a believer in Him. Do you draw strength from that as you approach these final hours?
I do, through God's help. I have been able to come to the point where much too late, but better late than never, feel the hurt and the pain that I am responsible for. Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years later because it revives in me all those terrible feelings.
The police were still no closer to finding evidence or a culprit for the disappearances. They started compiling a database with all the information they had, friends or classmates of each victim, men named Ted who owned Volkswagens, known sex offenders and more. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 separate lists. And one was Ted Bundy. On August 16, 1975, Utah officer Bob Hayward spotted Ted driving in a residential area in the early hours of the morning, and as soon as Bundy saw the patrol car, he took off at high speed. Hayward gave chase and managed to arrest Bundy. Upon searching the vehicle, the officer noticed that the front passenger seat was taken out and placed on the back seats. He also found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items that are usually used for burglaries. Ted, however, denied this, claiming the mask was simply for skiing. He said he found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and the rest were just normal household items. He also claimed that he only sped off at the sight of the officer because he was smoking marijuana and wanted to get rid of the evidence. However, Detective Jerry Thompson remembered a very similar description of Ted and his vehicle during the kidnapping of Carole de Ranch the previous November, in addition to Elizabeth's many phone calls. They searched Ted's apartment and found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with the Wildwood Inn specifically checkmarked, as well as a brochure for the Viewmont High School where Deborah Kent had gone missing. However, this wasn't enough evidence and Bundy was let go. Once home, Ted destroyed a collection of Polaroid photographs he had taken of his victims, which the officers completely missed during their search. Salt Lake City police now put Ted under 24-hour surveillance, and Elizabeth Klepfer was questioned. Elizabeth admitted that during the year before Ted moved to Utah, she would discover objects around her house or Ted's apartment that she just couldn't understand, like crutches, a bag of plaster of Paris which he admitted he stole from a medical supply house, and she believed he used to fake his injuries to gain the women's trust, surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, a wrench taped halfway up the handle which he kept in the back of his car, a sack full of women's clothing, and a meat cleaver that he never used for cooking. Ted was also in great debt at the time, and Elizabeth believed almost everything he owned was stolen. She did confront him at one point about his new TV and stereo, and Ted warned her that if she told anyone, he would break her neck. Their relationship would often be tested. Bundy would promise to stop stealing but then go right back to it immediately after. He would also very often grow angry or upset if Elizabeth ever considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle, much like many of his victims. She would even awaken in the middle of the night sometimes to find him under the covers with a flashlight, examining her body. Detectives were able to confirm that Ted had not been with Elizabeth at any point during any of the abductions, but it was during this time she discovered the truth about Bundy's other relationships, specifically his previous engagement to Diane Edwards. But much like before, they remained together. In September, Ted actually sold his Volkswagen as a way to get rid of evidence, but the Utah police impounded it, and the FBI dismantled and searched the vehicle for clues. They found hairs matching samples from Karen Campbell's body. They also found hair strands of Melissa Smith and Carole de Ranch, though others say these were much more inconclusive than the previous ones. They now had some evidence to link Ted to the disappearances. 3 different victims who had never met all somehow happened to be in his car at some point in time by coincidence, which is incredibly unlikely. But Bundy continued to protest his innocence, claiming that the police wanted him to be guilty to end the manhunt, and therefore planted the evidence on him.
And I'll tell you, as long as they attempt to keep their heads in the sand about me, there's going to be people turning up in canyons, and there are going to be people being shot in Salt Lake City because the police there aren't willing to accept what I think they know, and they know that I didn't do these things. I think it's a terribly dangerous mentality to try to pin something on somebody who they believe there's a possibility it couldn't have done it. And as long as they believe that, they're not going to find the right man. And the man who kidnapped Carole de Ranch is going to continue to be free. And not only her, but every other young woman in the Salt Lake Valley is going to be threatened by that person or persons. And it's happening today, and it's going to happen in the future.
Despite again trying to disguise his appearance, on October the 2nd, Bundy was put into a lineup and Carole DeRonch immediately identified him. Witnesses that same day also pointed him out as the man they had seen lingering around the high school auditorium moments before Deborah Kent went missing. Despite this, there wasn't enough evidence to link him to the latter, as her body wasn't discovered until later. However, there was at least enough evidence to charge him with the kidnapping and assault of Carole DeRonch. Ted again claimed that the police were setting him up. Before being charged, Carole was shown a photo lineup and she failed to correctly identify Ted as her abductor. Bundy claimed that the officers showed her the real photo beforehand in order for her to correctly identify him in the face-to-face lineup. Ted was bailed out by his parents for $15,000 as they maintained his innocence. He then spent most of his time during the saga in Seattle, Washington, living with Elizabeth Klepfer. They didn't have nearly enough evidence to link him to the murders in Washington, but they did keep him under high surveillance. Elizabeth claimed they couldn't even go outside on the porch without police cars starting up their engines, ready to follow them if necessary. Detectives had convinced themselves that Ted Bundy was indeed the killer, but they knew they needed more evidence before they could charge him with anything, while Bundy claimed they were just wasting their time on him instead of looking for the real murderer.
You'll have to admit there's a hell of a lot of circumstantial evidence, at least circumstantial. It seems to somebody who has simply read newspapers and articles.
No, I won't admit that. No, I don't call it, it's not circumstantial as far as I'm concerned. I don't really know exactly what you're referring to, and I don't really want to discuss it. But I don't care what anybody says or the suspicions anyone harbors on the basis of that misinformation. And indeed, that's what I call it, circumstantial information perhaps, but misinformation as far as I'm concerned.
A popular rumour was that Ted Bundy actually underwent a polygraph test to prove that he was innocent, and surprisingly, it came back that he was telling the truth, while others say it was inconclusive. However, not only is it worth noting that these tests are only 97% effective and aren't admissible in a court of law, but there are also no credible sources to confirm Ted even took a polygraph test to begin with. Regardless of whether or not he did and whether or not he passed, it is believed that Bundy knew enough about law and was intelligent enough to be able to beat the test anyway, as many confirmed serial killers have done before. He had a lot less anxiety and a lot more confidence than those usually asked to adhere to these kind of examinations.
You are not guilty.
I'm not guilty. Does that include the time I stole a comic book when I was 5 years old? I am not guilty of the charges which have been filed against me.
And the allegations?
And the allegations.
And the rumors and the
I don't know all of what you're speaking about, Lucky. It's too broad and I can't get into it in any detail. But I'm satisfied with my blanket statement that I'm innocent. No man is truly innocent. I've been impolite, and there are things I regret having done in my life, but nothing like the things I think that you're referring to.
Have you ever physically harmed anyone?
Ever physically harmed anyone? No. No. You know, again, not in the context I think that you're speaking of.
In February of 1976, Bundy stood trial for the kidnapping of Carole DeRonch. He was advised to waive his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case, but after a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Ted was still found guilty of kidnapping and assault, despite continuing to claim his innocence.
My chance to talk to the press. Contrary to Section 78204 Florida statute.
I'll plead not guilty right now.
And your grand jury...
In June, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October that year, he was discovered hiding in the bushes in the prison yard carrying road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, planning an escape. He was forced to spend several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that same month, due to the evidence found inside his car, Colorado police were now able to charge him with the murder of Karen Campbell. He was soon transferred to Aspen, Colorado in January of 1977. During this time, Elizabeth broke the news to Ted that it was actually her who reported him to the police, but she regretted it deeply, believing now that he was 100% innocent. Bundy wasn't even angry at her and asserted that he was not guilty and the world would see that soon enough.
Are you angry?
Sure, I get angry. Very, very angry and indignant. I don't like being locked up. for something I didn't do, and I don't like my liberty taken away, and I don't like being treated like an animal, and I don't like people walking around and ogling me like I'm some sort of weirdo, because I'm not.
I'm leaving Corporal. No, you're not. I'm leaving my presence. Good. Then, Bundy, Fletcher, and I'm leaving Corporal. See, Bundy? I'm not leaving this room in a jury box, and I'm not going through this, and you knew that, Your Honor. Sit down. You know how far you can push me. You want to make a circus? You've got a circus, and you'll have this. I'll rain on your parade, Jack. You'll see a thunderstorm. This will not be the packed little drama you will rain.
You think about getting out of here?
Well, legally, sure. The Utah State Prison, as you know, is surrounded by several barbed wire fences and has many guards and towers, and they've got dogs that run around there, and they've got bars in the cells, and they've got count procedures. And what do you think that's all for? That's to keep the man in there.
On June the 7th, Ted had his preliminary hearing and decided to serve as his own attorney, which allowed him to be let out of handcuffs and or leg shackles. During a break, he asked permission to visit the library to research more of his case. Once inside, Bundy hid behind a bookcase to escape the view of the guard before leaping out of a window on the 2nd story, though he sprained his ankle on the landing, but still managed to escape. Ted had been practicing this for months beforehand, jumping from his prison cell bunk bed to the floor repeatedly to strengthen the muscles in his legs, without much success. Bundy discarded his outer clothing and then casually walked through Aspen undetected as roadblocks were being set up everywhere in an attempt to recapture him. He hiked towards Aspen Mountain before breaking into a hunting cabin where he stole some food, clothing and a rifle. The next day he headed towards Crested Butte but ended up becoming lost in the woods. He wandered aimlessly around the mountains for 2 days, missing 2 trails that led directly to where he was trying to go. On June the 10th, he broke into a trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles south of Aspen, stealing food and a ski parka. But instead of venturing further away, Bundy decided to head back towards Aspen, despite the numerous roadblocks and ongoing search parties. 3 days later, Ted stole a car at the edge of the Aspen golf course, but was cold, wet from the rain, sleep deprived, and in agony from his sprained ankle. So he drove back into Aspen. 2 police officers noticed his erratic driving, pulled him over and recaptured him. Inside the car were maps of the entire mountain area around Aspen, proving he had planned this escape for quite some time. Once again, Ted was back in jail. Friends and attorneys all tried to convince him to just stay where he was. What little evidence there was against him was weak, the case was slowly diminishing and it was going in his favour. If he had remained there and simply waited for the case to run its course, he could have gotten away with it. But Ted was already planning his next move. Bundy managed to get his hands on a detailed floor plan of the jail, a hacksaw blade from some other inmates, and he even managed to smuggle in $500 over the course of 6 months. While other inmates were showering every evening making a lot of noise, Ted managed to saw a hole about 1 foot square between the steel reinforcing bars of the cell's ceiling. He then intentionally lost about 35 pounds so he was able to wriggle through into the small crawl space above. For weeks, Ted practiced this plan. He explored the space and ensured it would all come to pass perfectly. Many people noticed and heard movement from the ceiling at night and did report it, but no further investigation was done. By late 1977, Bundy's trial was still ongoing. Ted requested the case be transferred to Denver due to all the publicity it was getting. The move was denied, but the judge agreed that a change of venue was necessary, and on December the 23rd, he moved the case to Colorado Springs. However, on the night of December the 30th, while most of the jail staff were now on Christmas break, and many prisoners who weren't overly violent were allowed passes home to be with their families, Ted piled books and files onto his bed, covered them with a blanket to make it look like he was asleep, and climbed up into the crawl space. He then broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the closet, and simply walked out of the front door to complete freedom. Ted stole a car, but it soon broke down in the mountains. A passing motorist gave him a lift into Vail, Colorado. From there, he took a bus to Denver, where he took a flight to Chicago, Illinois. Back in the jail, his escape was not discovered until December the 31st at noon, over 17 hours later. Ted was already in Chicago by the time they realized he was gone. Once there, he took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he stayed until January the 2nd. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove to Atlanta, Georgia, before boarding a bus to Tallahassee, Florida on January the 8th. Bundy rented a room under the fake name of Chris Hagen near the Florida State University campus. He intended to get a legitimate job and refrain from further criminal activities, believing he could remain free and undetected in Florida forever, as long as he didn't attract the attention of the police. However, this failed when he applied for a position at a construction site and refused to give proper identification. This led to Ted returning to his old ways of shoplifting and stealing credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping trolleys in supermarkets. In the early hours of January the 15th, 1978, a mere week after Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, Ted entered the Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door which had a faulty lock. Around 2:45 a.m, Ted bludgeoned 21-year-old Margaret Bowman with a piece of oak firewood as she slept, and proceeded to choke her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy, beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore one of her nipples, bit deeply into her left buttock, and sexually assaulted her with a bottle. Next, he attacked Kathy Kleiner, broke her jaw and deeply lacerated her shoulder, followed by Karen Chandler, who he gave a concussion, a broken jaw, loss of teeth and a crushed finger. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler both survived, but they believe it was only due to a car's headlight shining in and scaring Bundy away. It's believed that all 4 attacks took place in the span of just 15 minutes, within earshot of over 30 witnesses who somehow heard nothing.
The parents of these girls are fairly decent people. I don't know, and I really feel for them because apparently they've suffered an incredible tragedy in their lives. The loss of a loved one is probably the most extreme kind of loss you can suffer in this life. And I feel as much for them as anybody can, not having gone through that myself.
After leaving the sorority house, Ted broke into a basement apartment 8 blocks away and attacked student Cheryl Thomas, dislocated her shoulder and fractured her jaw and skull in 5 places. She survived but was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her entire dancing career. On her bed, a semen stain was found, as well as a pantyhose mask with 2 hairs inside.
What happens if you're in prison 5 years and nothing like what has happened in the past happens again?
What do you mean?
I mean, any of the things that you have been accused of by innuendo, by rumor, by the police departments or whatever. What if there are no killings or no kidnappings?
It's already happened, hasn't it? I've heard some reports. I number the incidents between 5 and 8, which are similar to the ones which the police have had the nerve to try to associate with me. It's going to continue to happen in Salt Lake and Utah until those police start to wise up and stop counting their chickens before they hatch.
On February the 8th, Ted stole a van and drove to Jacksonville, Florida. There, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the police chief. But Ted soon fled the scene when Leslie's brother showed up and stood up to him. He then headed 60 miles towards Lake City. At the junior high school the next morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher since she had forgotten her purse. But Kimberly never returned. It wasn't until 12 weeks later, after an extensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Suwannee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. She had been raped and killed. Her underwear were found near the body containing semen. There was evidence to suggest that she was stripped, raped, redressed, and then stripped again. On February the 12th, Ted no longer had any money to pay his overdue rent and was concerned that the police were closing in on him, so he stole a car and left Tallahassee driving west. Just 3 days later, around 1 a.m, he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line for a simple warranty check, but it was discovered that the Volkswagen Beetle he was driving was stolen. As soon as Lee was radioed the information, he attempted to place Ted under arrest, but Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and sprinted away. David Lee fired 2 shots before chasing and tackling him to the ground. After further struggle, the officer came out on top and managed to finally arrest Ted Bundy. Inside the stolen vehicle were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female students, 21 stolen credit cards, a stolen television set, dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses, and a pair of plaid slacks, which would later be identified as Ted's disguise as a firefighter. During the drive, David Lee had absolutely no idea that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives in the entire country. He remembered hearing Ted whisper, "I wish you had killed me." During the Florida trials, Ted gave the fake identification of Kenneth Misner. The issue was, Kenneth Misner was a real person. Officials had to confirm that Ted was not him. Bundy refused to give his real identity, which also meant he wasn't able to be released on bail. He wasn't known in Florida, so there was absolutely no way to link him to the disappearances and attacks in Washington, Colorado, or Utah. Bundy was kept in custody with no name as the court tried to figure out what to do with him. Eventually, it was discovered that his vehicle was stolen near the Chi Omega sorority house. Furthermore, Ted finally revealed his real name, but only in exchange for a phone call to Elizabeth Klepfer. Ironically, around the same time, Klepfer heard of the attacks and had a gut feeling that Ted was there, and informed the Florida police. After Ted had escaped, the authorities were convinced that he would try to make contact with Elizabeth and were going to tap her phone, but he rang before this could be done. On February the 16th, 1978, Ted Bundy called Elizabeth and came the closest he ever got to confessing to her, but she was at least finally able to know some of the truth. "You shouldn't be calling me," I told him. "There's a tap on the phone." I lied. He was crying. It's okay. I'm in custody, it's all over." "Where?" I asked. "Well, I made a deal with the police. They aren't going to announce my arrest until tomorrow morning so that I can talk with you and my family. It's going to be bad when it breaks." "I'm not going to call up Channel 7, I told him. "Where are you?" "Florida. Pensacola." "Oh no. I was hoping you'd be picked up anywhere but Florida. I saw this picture in the paper last month. Those sorority women were murdered. I told the FBI that I hoped you weren't there." "It's going to be bad," he said. "Real bad when it breaks tomorrow. I want you to be prepared. It could be real ugly." "Are you a suspect in those murders?" I asked. I wish we could sit down, alone, and talk about things, with nobody listening. About why I am the way I am. There was a long pause. I didn't want to know, but I asked anyway. "Are you telling me that you're sick?" "Back off," he barked. "I meant, how come I've hurt you so many times?" I was startled by the abruptness of his answer. I said nothing. Ted and I continued to talk. I told him I was surprised that he was back in custody, that I thought he would rather be dead than be a prisoner again. "I thought so too," he told me. "I'm really disappointed in myself. I just didn't have what it takes to die." I wanted to talk more about the circumstances of his arrest, particularly about the murders I'd read about. He told me not to bring it up again. They didn't want to talk about it. 2 days later, on February the 18th at 2 a.m, Ted rang Elizabeth once again. "I want to talk about what we were talking about on Thursday," he said haltingly. "About being sick?" I asked. "Yes, I've been talking with a priest." He was crying. "I'm going to try to clear things up in a way that I'll be back in Washington. I have a responsibility to those who have suffered, and I want to reconcile things," he went on in a weak voice. "I was afraid you would have nothing to do with me if I told you." His voice was so weary that I started to cry. "Didn't you always think it was possible?" "No," I said. "I didn't think it could be true. I had my doubts, but I just couldn't accept it. Sometimes I wondered if it was me, that you hated me and wanted to kill me. No, there is something the matter with me. It wasn't you, it was me. I just couldn't contain it. I fought it for a long time. It got too strong. We just happened to be going together when it got underway. I tried, believe me. I tried to suppress it. It was taking more and more of my time. That's why I didn't do well in school. The time was being used trying to make my life look normal, but it wasn't normal. All the time I could feel that force building in me. Did you ever... How was I going to put this? Did you ever want to kill me?" There was a long, heavy silence. "Well, there was one time when I was really trying hard to control it, so I'd been staying off the streets and trying to feel normal. But it just happened that I was sleeping with you at your house when I felt it coming on. I closed the damper so the smoke couldn't go up the chimney, and then I left and put a towel in the crack under the door so the smoke would stay in the apartment. I remember that night well. I'd been pretty drunk by the time we clubbed into the hide-a-bed in front of the fireplace. I woke up briefly as Ted was leaving, and he told me he was going back to his house to get his fan because the fireplace was backed up. I'd sleepily pulled the covers over my head because I couldn't breathe, but soon I couldn't breathe under the covers either. My eyes were running and I was coughing. I jumped out of bed and threw open the nearest window and stuck my head out. After I had recovered some, I opened all the windows and the doors and broke up the fire the best I could. I'd gotten on Ted the next day for not coming back with a fan. As he told me now that he had wanted me to die that night, I almost didn't believe him. It didn't fit in with the murders. I thought that maybe he wasn't willing to talk about any more serious attempts to kill me. However, once Elizabeth gathered the courage to inform the police of Ted's admission, he completely denied it and claimed that she twisted everything he had actually said. He accused her of betraying his trust by exposing a private conversation and by twisting things out of context to what she thought she heard, continuing to insist on his complete innocence. In addition to the stolen car evidence, some eyewitnesses identified Ted, claiming they saw him leaving the sorority house around the time of the attack, although some weren't 100% sure as they didn't get a decent enough look. The witness accounts weren't particularly strong cases to go by, but it was enough to at least keep Ted in custody for questioning. Bundy was soon relocated to Miami, Florida before standing trial for the Chi Omega murders in June of 1979. This was the first ever trial to be televised nationally in the United States. The court offered 5 different attorneys attorneys, but Ted refused and again defended himself.
Why did you decide to defend yourself?
I began thinking about that way back in Utah. I had a year to study criminal law in action, and I have a lot of I'm a very biased person, and I have a lot of strong opinions about how things should be done.
It was concluded that Bundy did a terrible job from the very beginning because he was facing a possible death sentence, but he was far more concerned with being in charge and the centre of attention than defending his case. He would often question the police officers at the scene of the crime, asking them to repeatedly describe what they found, almost proud of the massacre that he left behind. However, Bundy was offered a deal. If he simply pled guilty to the killing of Levy and Bowman, he would be spared the death penalty and would instead be given a 75-year prison sentence. Ted was still adamant that he was innocent, so he saw this as a win-win. He could plead guilty but then wait a few years for the evidence to disintegrate and for witnesses to retract their testimonies. However, he changed his mind at the last minute and even used this as a defense. Bundy blamed the court's incompetency for offering him this deal, claiming that they had given up on him, believing an innocent man was guilty, and he refused to go along with it. Ted thought that this would be a very tactical move to prove his innocence, others believing it was incredibly foolish and narcissistic. Bundy just couldn't bear to stand up in front of the whole world and admit that he was actually guilty of something. They had also previously surprised Ted by making a mould of his teeth, and they perfectly matched the bite wounds on Lisa Levy's body, although it should be noted that bite mark evidence has been largely discounted in recent years. Regardless, the jury deliberated for around 7 hours before finding Ted Bundy guilty of murder and 2 counts of burglary on July the 24th, 1979.
You never showed any emotion.
Yeah.
For somebody who believes he is so innocent, why was there no emotion?
My attorney, John O'Connell in Salt Lake, and I've always mused over just how I should behave. What's the right way for Ted Bundy to behave and make sure that people get the right impression? You know, what am I supposed to do? Am I going to jump up on the table? Am I going to scream? That's what I felt like doing. I heard my mother crying. People say, Ted Bundy didn't show any emotion. There must be something in that. I showed emotion. You know what people said? See, he really can get violent and angry. There's no right way for me to act.
6 months passed before Bundy faced a second trial in Orlando for the murder of Kimberly Leach. After 8 hours deliberation, he was again found guilty thanks to a witness seeing Ted leading Leach from the schoolyard to his stolen van, as well as evidence of clothing fibres found in the van and on Kimberly's body that matched the jacket Ted was wearing the day he was arrested. As his sentence drew closer, Ted tried another tactical move. In the state of Florida, a marriage proposal in court in the presence of a judge is considered a completely legitimate marriage. As he was questioning former colleague Carole Ann Boone, who had since moved to Florida to be near him and had constantly defended his innocence, he proposed to her, and she accepted.
Carole, do you want to marry me?
Yes.
And I want to marry you?
Yes.
And I do want to marry you.
He said you did.
They were now legally married. Ted hoped, since this was in essence his wedding day, the court would go easy on him and certainly not punish him on such a special occasion. Regardless, on February the 10th, 1980, Ted was sentenced to death by electrocution. As this was announced, Bundy stood up and exclaimed, "Tell the jury they were wrong." He still maintained his complete innocence.
Do you deserve the punishment the state has inflicted upon you?
That's a very good question, and I'll answer very honestly. I don't want to die. I'm not going to kid you. I'll kid you not.
In October of 1981, Carole Ann Boone actually gave birth to a little girl called Rose, and Ted was somehow the father. It's believed that Bundy had bribed a guard with money to allow some alone time with her during one of the visits. As the trials ended and the sentence was announced, Ted went through a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. He insisted on his innocence for the longest time, so they suggested he explain what he thought happened so he could discuss it in the third person, therefore avoiding the stigma of a confession. After over 100 hours of taped interviews, Ted never confessed to any assault or murder. He did, however, begin to admit to his burglary crimes, confirming Elizabeth's story. He claimed that he just enjoyed seeing anything he desired and being able to take it. In July of 1984, prison guards discovered 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Ted Bundy's cell. One of the cell windows had a steel bar completely sawed through and then glued back into place with some soap-based adhesive. They then discovered an unauthorized mirror and moved him to a different cell. Not long after, he had an altercation with another criminal, John Hinckley Jr., the man who attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. There are also stories of Ted being raped in prison, though Bundy always denied this.
I have never been accused, I have never been assaulted, I have never been verbally abused.
In October 1984, Bundy contacted Officer Robert Keppel to share his apparent expertise in the psychology of a serial killer. The Green River Killer Gary Ridgway was still on the loose and they needed help. Being a student of psychology, Ted seemed to think he knew all about serial killers and thought he could be of some use. Ridgway would remain at large for another 17 years. In early 1986, March the 4th was set for Bundy's execution, but was later rescheduled for unknown reasons. By April, July the 2nd was the new date, but just 15 hours before Ted was due to be executed, the court suspended the case for further review, not believing Ted's mental state was competent enough to stand trial back in 1979. It was later scheduled for November the 18th, 1986, but just one day prior, it was again postponed. In mid-1988, a re-evaluation of the case was denied, and finally, January the 24th, 1989 was confirmed as his date of execution. The police have claimed that this was moved as quickly as possible and nobody used any delaying tactics. This was one of the faster cases as far as they were concerned, but it took a whole 9 years for Ted to finally be taken to execution. With all appeals now denied, Ted finally had no reason to lie, and after almost a decade and a half of denying it, he finally confessed to murder.
Ted, how did it happen? Take me back. What are the antecedents of the behavior that we've seen? So much grief, so much sorrow, so much pain for so many people. Where did it start? How did this moment come about?
He went into details with the sick things he did to the victims afterwards, including necrophilia. It's believed he only confessed to these acts in hopes to escape the electric chair. He also confessed to decapitating about 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and keeping at least one of their heads. Bundy gave conflicting numbers on his total kills. In one conversation he said 36, but on the evening before his execution, 30, though 7 of those victims remain unidentified to this day. He confessed to the death of Donna Manson on Taylor Mountain, which was never known, and he even incinerated her head in Elizabeth Klepfer's fireplace. He claimed he had murdered in California, but the victim remains a mystery. However, back when he was speaking in the third person, he implied that he had killed more than 100 people, though some believe as a compulsive liar that Ted stretched the truth and he wasn't responsible for some of the missing person cases. He simply wanted to exaggerate his body count to increase his infamy and ego, though Robert Keppel believed Ted had murdered many more than the final 30 he confirmed. During these final confessions, when asked why, Ted said he began killing to avoid being caught, but it soon became an addiction, fueled by his viewing of violent pornography.
I'm not blaming pornography and not saying that it caused me to go out and do certain things. And I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies, didn't it?
Well, in the beginning it fuels this kind of thought process. I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception. Deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
Yeah, that's true.
Ted claims that murder became a part of him, but he considered himself an amateur in his early years, and that he wasn't a pro until the death of Lynda Healy in 1974, implying he had murdered well before then, which he often denied. Many still believe his first murder was that of Anne-Marie Burr in August of 1961, 13 years before Lynda Healy's death, when Ted was just 14, though he always denied this claim. He said that he would never hurt a little girl, despite his final known murder victim being 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a murder that Ted consistently refused to talk about.
I can't really talk about that right now. That's
too painful.
Interestingly, Bundy is on record saying a murderer's first ever kill is special and should never be discussed. He described his brutal attacks in great detail, showing no remorse, and he seemed to take pride in them all. He also seemed to leave out specific details in hopes to delay his execution further, but to no avail. For some murders, he claimed the remains were left in a certain area, but once searched, none were found. Some of the victims' families even petitioned to postpone his execution again in hopes that Ted would reveal more information, but these were denied. Carole Ann Boone had always believed in his innocence and now felt deeply betrayed to learn otherwise. She moved back to Washington with their daughter and divorced him. He tried to call her on the morning of his execution for one last talk, but she refused to pick up the phone. She had also learned that he had cheated on her as well as Elizabeth Klepfer. Carole and her daughter have since changed their names and haven't been heard from since. It's uncertain whether Bundy's daughter Rose is even aware of who her father was. Much like Boone, Klepfer also seemed to move away and has remained quiet until the recent releases of newer documentaries and feature films, while his first love, Diane Edwards, has also remained out of the public eye. On the day before his execution, Ted actually considered suicide, stating that he didn't want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die.
You are scheduled to be executed tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock if you don't receive another stay. What is going through your mind? What thoughts have you had in these last few days?
what's going through my mind right now is to use the minutes and hours that I have left as fruitfully as possible and see what happens. It helps to live in the moment in the essence that we use it productively. So right now I'm feeling calm, and in large part because I'm here with you. There is no way in the world that killing me is going to restore those beautiful children to their parents and correct and soothe the pain.
In his final interview, hours before death, Bundy finally appeared to show remorse and emotion, though not responsibility for his actions. Many believe this is all a ruse, in hopes to again delay or even prevent his execution. He even tried 10 minutes before his death to confess to even more murders, but it didn't work. Officials did try to use his willingness to talk to get answers about other unsolved murders and missing persons. On June the 23rd, 1966, in Seattle, 20-year-old flight attendants Lisa E. Wick and Lonnie Ree Trumbull were attacked and bludgeoned with a piece of lumber as they slept in their basement apartment near a store where Ted actually worked at the time when he was 19. Lisa Wick had permanent memory loss as a result, while Trumbull sadly passed away. Wick claims she knows for a fact that it was Bundy who attacked them, and officers did admit that it held a lot of similarities to the crime scene found at the Chi Omega sorority house 12 years later, though there was no definitive evidence to link Ted to the attack. On May the 30th, 1969, 19-year-old college friends Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry were on vacation when their car was found abandoned beside the Garden State Parkway just outside Somers Point, New Jersey. Their bodies were found 3 days later in the woods, one naked and one fully clothed. Bundy allegedly told a psychologist that his first ever victims were 2 women in the Philadelphia area. It was also believed that Ted had a car accident on the same weekend and was wearing a leg cast, which he may have used to gain their trust. However, there's no record of this car accident, and the case remains an unsolved mystery. On July the 19th, 1971, 24-year-old elementary school teacher Rita Patricia Curran was murdered in her basement in Burlington, Vermont after being strangled, bludgeoned, and raped. Her apartment was near where Ted was born, and the crime scene looks suspiciously similar to his later ones. There's no definitive evidence to place Bundy in Burlington that day. However, there are records of a Bundy being bitten by a dog that week, and Ted's whereabouts during the summer of 1971 remain unaccounted for. On July the 22nd, 1971, 21-year-old Joyce LePage disappeared from the campus of Washington State University, and her skeletal remains were found 9 months later wrapped in carpeting and military blankets, bound with a rope in a deep ravine. Bundy was later listed as a suspect, but was never confirmed. On June the 19th, 1973, 17-year-old Rita Lorraine Jolly disappeared from West Lynn, Oregon, and on August the 10th, 24-year-old Vicki Lynn Holler vanished from Eugene, Oregon. Ted admitted to 2 murders in that state but didn't identify them, and there wasn't enough time to interview him to confirm if these were the 2 or not. On November the 25th, 1973, 14-year-old Catherine Mary Devine was abducted, and her body was found a month later in the Capitol State Forest near Olympia, Washington. On May the 27th, 1974, 14-year-old Brenda Joy Baker disappeared from Puyallup, Washington. Her body was discovered in Millsvania State Park the next month. Bundy claimed that he had no knowledge of either case, and Catherine Devine's murder was solved in 2002 after DNA analysis pointed to William E. Cosden, though Brenda Baker's murder remains a mystery. On July the 1st, 1974, 19-year-old Sandra Jean Weaver vanished from Salt Lake City, Utah. Her naked body was found the next day near Grand Junction, Colorado. The murder remains a mystery, though there's conflicting reports as to whether or not Ted mentioned her name in his final interviews. On April the 15th, 1975, 18-year-old Melanie Suzanne Cooley disappeared in Nederland, Colorado. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later, bludgeoned and strangled in Coal Creek Canyon. After checking gas station receipts, it was confirmed that Bundy was near the location the day that she went missing, and many believe he was responsible, though there's not enough evidence to confirm it. On July the 1st, 1975, 24-year-old Shelley K. Robertson went missing from Golden, Colorado. Her naked and decomposing body was discovered the next month, 500 feet inside a mine near Winter Park Resort. Gas station receipts again put Ted nearby at the time, but no further evidence backs up the case. On July the 4th, 1975, 23-year-old Nancy Perry Baird vanished from Layton, Utah, and was never discovered. Ted always remained that he had absolutely nothing to do with her disappearance. In February of 1976, around the time Ted was being charged with the abduction of Carol DeRanch, 17-year-old Debbie Smith vanished from Salt Lake City, Utah. Her body was found 2 months later near the Salt Lake City International Airport. Many list her as one of Bundy's victims, but there's never been any confirmation. Though quizzed minutes before execution about all of these unsolved murders and disappearances, Ted denied any involvement one final time. Theodore Robert Bundy died in the electric chair at 7:16 a.m. on January the 24th, 1989, at the age of 42. For his final words, Bundy expressed sympathy and apologized for his actions. Hundreds of members of the public, as well as 20 off-duty police officers, stood outside, sang, danced, and celebrated as his death was confirmed. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range in accordance with his will, not far from where he had discarded so many of his victims so many years ago. Ted's mother Louise was heartbroken to learn that he had confessed, and always questioned what caused her son to perform these horrible actions, as he was raised right and never seemed like a troubled child to her. However, despite him officially confessing, Louise still insisted on his innocence, claiming that her son wasn't capable of doing these things. Throughout her entire life, even up to and after his execution, she maintained that her son was not a murderer, all the way up until her death in 2012. Some believe she had no empathy or ability to understand the situation, and it may have been genetically passed on to Ted as well. The cause of Bundy's murderous lifestyle has forever baffled the world. He underwent psychiatric examinations while he was alive and was initially diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but this was later ruled out. It was also believed that he had multiple personality disorder. Ted himself denied this, however, claiming that he never blacked out, didn't hear voices, and always fully remembered what it was that he was doing. But many witnesses claimed that Ted would change into a completely different person at will, including his great aunt, who claimed that she waited with him at a dark train station once, and he turned into what seemed like a complete stranger. She was absolutely terrified of him. However, it seemed like he leaned more towards antisocial personality disorder, as he had outward charm and charisma with little true personality or genuine insight. He had the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, but it had minimal effect on his behaviour, and he would feel no guilt or remorse. Another theory is that he had narcissistic personality disorder. He confessed to 30 murders, but he never took responsibility for any of them. He blamed his actions on his abusive grandfather, the absence of his biological father, the concealment of his true parentage, alcohol, the media, the police who he believed planted evidence on him, society in general, violence on television, true crime periodicals, and even pornography. He even blamed television for brainwashing him into stealing, and he even blamed the victims, claiming that their facial expressions showed they were already afraid of him, and stated that they invited the abuse and they expected to be hurt. Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers in history, and he still raises discussion to this day. He confessed to 30 murders, though the number in all likelihood is much, much higher. But what sent this young up-and-coming politician, this intelligent law student, into such a spiraling decline of madness? We may never know when his murderous rampage began, but it ended with his death 31 years ago, and we are still seeking answers.